So in a minute, I'm going to turn to the panelists and ask them to introduce themselves, but I just wanted to say a few words to start the event, something that I've been really looking forward to. It's great to have this group of people here to answer some of our questions. So the question of what we can do to build ecosystems to enable civil society to thrive is really close to INTRAC's heart. For those of you who know about us, you'll know that we say we're unashamedly for civil society, and that our core belief is that vibrant, diverse and inclusive civil societies are essential catalysts for a world where everyone can thrive. And in our strategy, we talk about how we want to see civil society actors, organisations and movements across the world supported so that they can develop, engage with others and do what they want to do better. In our strategic framework, we argue that civil society support is vital to this, so that actors can respond to their changing environments, to become the sort of organisations they imagine themselves to be, and to understand whether and how their programmes are having the intended impact. Support strengthens their ability to be resilient, impactful and legitimate into the future. We also say that civil society support should contribute to fundamental shifts in international development, to enable space and investment for locally determined and owned practice and long-term sustainable rooted civil society. But for this to happen, support needs to be available nationally, embedded as part of national ecosystems of civil society. And that's why we believe as INTRAC, we can contribute, and it's really important that we work to strengthen and transform these national systems of national ecosystems of civil society support. It's been less than a year since we launched our strategic framework, which is called Locally Rooted, Globally Connected, for those of you who haven't seen it. And the trends that we noted in the operating environment appear to have further deteriorated. So civic space is under more threat than ever in a greater number of countries. 2024 was the hottest year on record, and 2025 seems to have started with essentially the dismantling of the aid system, which is leading to shocks in many different contexts, from national health systems across many African countries to the UN, to the level of resourcing available for civil society. So we've been thinking about, how do we translate our beliefs and vision into practice? We're wanting to contribute to strengthening these ecosystems, but we're also seeing these ecosystems increasingly under threat. And the environment for civil society seems to become constantly more challenging. But we also know that at times of crisis, there's always opportunity. So given the shifts in context, what practical responses are there to ensure continued investment in national civil society and to develop support ecosystems that enable civil society to thrive? Ecosystems that support the vibrant, inclusive and just civil society that we're committed to, that value local leadership and local knowledge and recognise the importance of global connections and learning and solidarity. So that's sort of the framing for what we're going to talk about today. And to look at this in different ways and to grapple with how to translate this into practice, I'm joined by 5 INTRAC board members. This is the first time we've run an event like this, and I'm hoping it works well, and it will be the start of many. We feel very privileged at INTRAC to have such an inspiring set of board members who are all located in different sectors, in different geographical contexts, and with different experiences and perspectives. And so we thought it would be good to share them with you, if you like, and host this event so that you can hear from them. So I think that's probably enough from me. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and to sort of kick off the discussion by giving their view on what one key element of an ecosystem that enables civil society to thrive looks like. So what they think is most important. And I'm going to go through my panelists as they appear on my screen. So I've got Bijay Kumar first. So Bijay, would you like to introduce yourself and answer that question?
Thanks, Kate. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many colleagues coming in. My name is Bijay Kumar, as Kate said, and I'm currently living in Afghanistan, and I work for an international organization, Watch Child. One of the key things that actually perhaps is critical for all of us to think of and work on is how to strengthen the solidarity of the local groups as part of the ecosystem. And these local groups, which should be challenging and engaging the shrinking civic space locally and also globally. And they do that by being a solidarity group at local level, but connected to the global capacity, learning, uh, knowledge, as well as the policy influencing opportunities. Together, we can actually transform the world and engage in widening our civic space by being solidarity group at the ground and connected to the global processes. Back to you, Kate. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bijay, and welcome. And there's a nice publicity for War Child in your background as well, so people can remember where you're based. Natasha, you're next on my screen.
Sure, thanks, Kate, and thanks to you and the INTRAC team for having me. So I'm Natasha Jamal. I am the Vice President of Global Programs at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the social impact arm of MasterCard. Not to be confused by the MasterCard Foundation that I'm sure many on the call have heard about. So we sit within MasterCard proper. We do social impact work, but we operate completely independently to the foundation, and we operate globally. The foundation, a large portfolio, the foundation's major portfolio really sits within Africa. To answer your question around a key element of an ecosystem, and I guess it's sort of building a little bit on Bijay's remark, is really around partnerships. So partnerships have always been very critical in the development sector, but I think given some of the challenges and headwinds that are being faced at the moment, they are becoming even more critical. And when I talk about partnerships, I mean, of course, partnerships within civil society, partnerships with private sector, partnerships with local consultants on the ground, et cetera. And so always been very important, even more critical in the context of the challenges that we're facing today.
Thanks, Natasha. Yeah, partnership speaks strongly to INTRAC's beliefs as well. Ashley, you're next.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Green-Thompson. I am based in Johannesburg. I'm the director of an organization called Act Ubumbano, and Ubumbano is the Zulu word for solidarity. We effectively act as a resource to local community struggles. And I'm going to take a really cheeky plug here and say that we've just been awarded a Civicus Prize, the Nelson Mandela Graça Machel Award for Innovation. Check it out. A lot of fun. One word. So for me, a healthy ecosystem an ecosystem can't be healthy if we don't have honesty. I think that civil society is notorious for competing, for harboring agendas, for doing all sorts of other things and not playing open cards. So for me, if you're honest about your agenda, if you're honest about what resources you have access to, not just financial resources, but also political resources. If you're honest about your limitations, it means that you don't have to perform. And you can actually find it much easier to engage in partnerships and to work together to create a sector that I think is falling woefully short of holding power to account at the moment, globally and in our national context. So that would be my contribution, honesty. Thanks, Kate.
Great, thanks, Ashley. And yeah, congratulations on the prize. And that speaks well for honesty too, doesn't it? So thank you. Sareta, you're next.
Thanks, Kate. Hello, everyone. I'm also a fellow South African like Ashley. My name is Sareta Thomas. I'm based in Pretoria in South Africa. And I'm a financial management and sustainability consultant that have been in the sector for more than 23 years. I work with a mix of different organizations, from your community-based organization, your small civil society organizations, national, as well as then international NGOs, and quite often work directly with some of the funders as well. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to share with you some of my experiences working within the civil society sector. And, for me, a key element of an ecosystem that enables civil societies to thrive, I want to actually link it with what Natasha has said, and that is building that bridges between the different sectors, but also specifically between the different stakeholders within the development and humanitarian sector, where we can see more collaboration between the different stakeholders, that partnership, but at the same time that all of us also have access to the same information, to the same services, to the same opportunities and funding, that there's some fairness around it, as well as clear kind of, equality in terms of who has access to what. And then, being a consultant as well, for me was also very key, is looking at locally led development and how to strengthen the capacity of the local actors and how we can support, the local NGO, the local consultant, and support them to be successful and to implement projects that will help them to achieve their own objectives. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sareta. And I think we'll come back to some of those points as well later. And then Wanjiru, you're not even on my screen, but I know you're there. So hi.
Yes, I am here. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you for having me at this very interesting conversation. My name is Wanjiru Kanyiha. I'm the network coordinator of a network called the Global Public Investment Network. I know it's a mouthful, but we are in the business of rethinking international global financing and international cooperation. So you can imagine our work has been very busy in the past few, specifically this year, but we've been at it for a few years now, and it's more relevant than ever to be having this conversation about civil society and our place, in this new structure that we are trying to build. So your question is interesting, Kate, and for me, coming from a community-based background, I feel like a community-centered ecosystem, even for civil society, is critical. Putting communities at the front and center of everything that we do or we are trying to do will help us articulate the problems, will help us build these bridges, will help us, build the solidarity, support the communities to build the resilience they need in, in facing the challenges that they face. So having really community front and center for me is what will help us build an ecosystem that sustains itself, that helps communities to thrive, and that does not compete to the detriment of the communities that we are trying to serve. So for me, I feel that's most powerful and remains, my mantra even as I continue to serve in my current capacity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. As I said, really great to have you here and to have all these views to stimulate and start our discussion. I think, Wanjiru, what you were talking about just then leads well into my first question, which I was going to ask Ashley to start us off on, which is thinking about this sort of more constrained resource environment that we find ourselves in. Can building a domestic resource base be a route into financial sustainability for civil society in the global majority? What do you think about that? What would you like to say?
Thanks, Kate. In my 30 plus years of working in the nonprofit sector, there's always this thing about when you submit a proposal, the donors ask you, how are you going to make yourself financially sustainable? You're not. The wealth has left the developing world for centuries, unless you're relying on wealthy people making grants to you. There's going to be a measure of dependence on donor funding. And so we need to change the question somewhat about financial sustainability. So I think we've got to accept that there's always going to be the need for funding of civil society organizations, particularly because they play a role that it doesn't generate profit. It doesn't allow you to get into positions of power in government where you can enjoy, you pursue it as a career path because you might become the governor or the president or the prime minister. So there's always going to be a need to find resources to support that sector in our society that advances struggle and causes that are meant to try and make our world a better place, because the other two big sectors certainly don't necessarily have that as their core agenda item. So I think once we've accepted that, then I think it allows us to become more creative about how we find new and innovative ways of making sure that that financial resource base is there. So in short, I think that trying to generate financial resources locally is an important part of our role as civil society. And I think certainly here in South Africa, we're seeing increasingly local actors trying to develop a place where local social justice organizations can access resources for their work. So, Kate, in answering your question, I think it definitely is a route. I think that we must just be careful of making financial sustainability the sole indicator of sustainability of a critical civil society. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done around the relevance and the credibility of the programs that many civil society organizations have, that I think is just as important in finding the money to support that work. So in short, that would be my response. It does put on us a responsibility to start challenging those who have the money. And, you know, I think fortunately in South Africa, I think there's some really interesting new opportunities that are starting to percolate and bubble that I'm hoping we can take advantage of.
Thanks, Ashley. That's great. So yes, it's part of the solution, but we also need to challenge those who have the money to think about how they're spending it, and to recognise that it's not just about money. There's other aspects, credibility, I think you said, and effectiveness or legitimacy. Does anyone else want to add to Ashley's insights there? Or if not, I think that it's a good segue into the question I was going to ask you, Sareta, which is, what does financial resilience look like then?
I think that's an interesting question, Kate. I think it's a word that we've heard a lot the last couple of years, especially since COVID. You know, it is the kind of go-to for funders as well. How financially resilient are you? How financially sustainable are you? And basically what it means is that ability to withstand and to bounce back from any kind of financial shocks. I think currently we see the loss and changes within the funding landscape. And the key thing is to go and have a look, you know, how do we bounce back? And how do we maintain our financial stability and growth? How do we maintain being a going concern as an organization as well? It's a lot about having the right strategies. It's about having the right plans, the right kind of resources that will help us to absorb some of these changes, some of these shocks, and that we can continue to be sustainable as an organization to achieve our objectives. I think all of us do not only want to exist today and tomorrow, but we want to exist in the long run. And it's really thinking about that. How can I ensure I am financially resilient, that I do not always go in survival mode or crisis mode when certain things happen within the sector? So what does that mean in practice? I think it's first of all be able to cope with some of this adversity, some of these difficult situations that we are facing within the sector. Then it's the ability to recover, to survive that shock, to recover and resume our path to achieve our objectives, our mission as an organization. Along the way, to keep identifying opportunities and recognize some of the opportunities that come across our paths, whether it's partnerships or relationships with certain people, whether it's about access to information or funding. And then for me, it's key, and I've started saying that as well, is that building of a strong stakeholder foundation, because ideally you want to be able to fall back to these stakeholders that you've managed their relationships during the undifficult times as well, so that they have your back when it's really needed. So a lot for me about financial sustainability is really about planning, is looking in advance, go ahead. Where are we moving towards as an organization? Do we have clear plans in place, not only for today and tomorrow, but for the next 3 to 5 years? I quite often say to organizations, we need to be a little bit less project and donor focused and start to think more holistically as an organization. Where are we going to get the funding from in 3 years' time? So that it's not only about reacting to crises or when things goes wrong, but that you do have a long-term plan in place. It's also about, and Ashley mentioned some of that, is about diversifying your funding mix. Yes, you might be donor dependent and rely on funders, but it's also about that mix of different funders. Yes, of course, that's sometimes easier said than done, but with a long-term kind of financing strategy, it's easier to identify opportunities, to identify alternative financing options that will help your organization to grow its diversified funding base. It's definitely about building reserves. As you know, individually as well, you can't survive without savings, without that pot of money for a rainy day. And it's challenging to build those reserves. But I always say, I've never worked with an organization where there's at least not one thing that you can start to do to build reserves. And even if that's $1 a month, it's more than what you've had before. So it's putting your mind to it on how to really start to build your savings as an organization. Risk management, it's such a key area for financial resilience. We quite often wait until it happens and then we start to scramble around. But do we think about scenarios? Do we estimate some of those internal and external risks and manage it actively within our organizations? And then for me, I will always say it's about taking ownership and autonomy over your operating models. It's having good systems in place for financial management, for people and culture, for marketing and publicity, for all those different aspects. I think, we started by saying it's not all about just having enough money, but looking at the organization more strategically, having the right structures in place, having the right behaviors that allow civil society organizations to sustain their impact, even during difficult times and those financial turbulences.
That's great. That was like a RIM 101 in financial resilience. Thank you. Lots of things to think about practically there. Natasha, I'm going to go to you to sort of talk about some innovative new approaches. So we just heard from Sareta around what we should have been doing, maybe, what we should always do, always do generally in life, and how that might prevent something like the changes in the ODA environment to become a shock. But maybe you can sort of pick up and think about some ways to go forward. What innovative ideas could you share with us?
Yeah, and look, I think what we're seeing right now, sorry, just give me 1 second. Cool. So look, I think what we're seeing right now in terms of obviously sort of a very challenging operating environment, we've seen the sort of change in development funding over a couple of years now, right? And there's been sort of a sort of an undercurrent of it. And so what is quite clear, unfortunately, is as Sareta has mentioned, as Ashley alluded to, I mean, business as usual just doesn't work anymore. And we really need to think about what that sort of long-term and the sustainability play here is. I think one thing to kind of say that is important to contextualize is, and again, it's building on Sareta's point, is there is an opportunity to react and respond and navigate what's happening currently in the short term, but also an important to take a longer term view, right? To know that this is, life could look very different or in either way in 4 years and beyond, and as things shift and change. So how are you sort of straddling between being responsive to what's happening right now and then setting yourself up for the future? Part of that, and Sareta mentioned being sort of really crystal clear on your objectives, right? I think there's an opportunity to change the kinds of conversations that are happening with funders. So within the Center for Inclusive Growth, just to put it sort of in very practical terms, we have grantee relationships with about 100 organizations around the world. We've been talking to different organizations about what they need and what's our role and how we can support. And 3 things for us that are standing out that may serve as a source of inspiration on how to have different conversations with funders. One is we are thinking about how we help our grantees, or we're starting to think about how we help our grantees and our and the organizations within our network evolve their comms and narrative. And that builds into Sareta's point around really getting crystal clear around what your objectives are, to Ashley's point around being honest about what resources you have, where are your strengths, and then in this sort of environment where you're doing more with less, what are those things that you really want to focus on? And then how are you telling that story, and how are you articulating that story? And how are you leaning on others who can sort of provide the resources that you may not have to be able to develop this sort of evolved comms and narrative? The second is thinking beyond financial support. And again, this builds on some of the comments made earlier. Thinking about sort of within where I sit, private sector organizations, our ethos has always been, yes, we provide financial support to CSOs and to NGOs, et cetera. But really, what are the other assets that we can bring to the table? We have expertise around the world. We have relationships. We have relationships with other organizations. We have relationships with policymakers. And so again, thinking about, as you sort of, what the ask is to different organizations, and as you diversify your funding sources, outside of the financial element, which is critical, what are the other assets and the other ways that some of these organizations can support in advancing objectives for the CSOs? And then finally, I think exploring, and from our perspective, we're thinking about exploring alternative funding models, right? So toying with this idea of things like recoverable grants or program-related investments, and just sort of rethinking. And again, I think the one-word picture here is that diversification, right? So diversifying who you're talking to, what you're asking for, and then how you're how you're managing your finances in different ways to manage grant requests and financial requests.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natasha. 3 really practical ideas there. And then maybe just to take us to a slightly different perspective, Wanjiru, you could tell us a bit about what you think a post-aid environment could look like for civil society funding and sustainability.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kate. That's a very interesting question, especially now that you're at an inflection point with everything that has been happening in the past few months. Obviously, we know and we acknowledge that, the way the aid system was set up was flawed, right? And it was unfit for the 21st century, unfit, unequitable, and all those things, right? So we are at a point where we have the opportunity to rebuild something, right? And the tragedy is if we end up rebuilding something that carries with it the relics of the old system, right? So the relics of colonization and exclusion and all those other things. So I think for us, even as civil society, we really need to figure out how we reframe the conversation. And part of the conversation is the paradigm shift, right? So how do we reframe the conversation from aid to solidarity, justice, and mutuality, right? We have to recognize the historical extraction and power imbalances that have been set up within the aid system. So recognizing that, we must create a new system where funding must be reparative, rooted in economic and social justice, and not paternalism. For example, there was a report that was done by Waxy and Bond, that was recommending that we ring-fence, that civil society ring-fence at least 25% of funds for CSOs, right? For lower and middle income countries as a baseline and not a ceiling. So this is an aspiration. So part of our role as civil society is to push for these reforms at government policy level, all the way to global level, because we have the opportunity now to look at it as away from charity, but as an investment in our future, our shared future. What does international cooperation look like? So from aid to justice, solidarity, and mutuality. Secondly, I think it gives us a very good opportunity to again center locally led development, not as a buzzword, not as a thing that's been bounced around and people not actually putting it into practice. But this means transforming how we work. The community-based organizations should lead, not just implement, right? So some models that exist actually put the resources directly into the hands of local actors, trusting them to know their priorities, trusting them to know exactly what they need to do with the resources, and trusting them to report back, to be accountable and transparent and all of these things. So this provides us an opportunity to actually be truly locally led and to lead from the front with respect to this. And that's where my comment about centering communities came from, because they have the solutions. They know their problems, they know their solutions, and equipping them with the resources they need to come up with these solutions will be one of the ways that we transform our sector. So for me, I think reviewing the governance structures of how we are set up as civil society, how the funding flows, even within our own institutions, how decision-making is made, really needs to be front and center in this post-aid world. The third point will be about funding movements as solidarity engines for sustainability. I have witnessed firsthand that movements are essential. They're an essential part of the civil society infrastructure. So if you're talking about feminist movement, climate justice, disability rights movements, and so on. So sustainability really depends on supporting these movements and collective action that comes out of these movements. And this crosses borders, it crosses, these networks and demands for system change that we all want to see. The fourth point, is something Natasha mentioned. It's about innovative finance models. And what I'm going to add on this is not to create models that are creating new markets and putting people, profits above people, but it's really about resourcing collective well-being. Because I feel like most stress points for most communities is lack of a social protection floor or social safety net. So if we can come up with innovating financial models that move communities away from survival mode, or away from bankruptcy, due to one family crisis, then we're able to help build resilient communities. Communities can focus on enterprise and other things that help them shape their well-being and their resilience and resourcing as part of self-determination. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. So that was great. Lots of ideas around how to respond in the moment, how to build sort of longer term financial resilience, and how to shift the question, I guess. So thinking about your organisation, thinking about finance or resilience and sustainability way beyond the funding, and thinking about putting people at the heart. Is there any other comment from the panel before we move on to a different topic? And if not, then I think I'll move on to the next topic, which was around consultancy. Obviously, this is something that's very important to INTRAC. We do a lot of civil society support through consultancy, but by using the term consultancy, we're really thinking about any actor that provides support to organisations and movements and other actors in civil society. And so it's a very sort of broad term. I wondered, Sareta, if you could talk to me a bit about what could be done to strengthen access to local consultants, especially at a time when international assistance is being cut.
Thank you, Kate. I think it's so important to strengthen the access to local consultants in the current kind of climate and environment that we're operating in. I think it's very timely and it's very critical that we start to put more emphasis in using local consultants to ensure more sustainability, capacity building, and decolonizing aid. I think there definitely needs to be some changes within the sector, thinking in terms of who to use for the work that we do locally. And one thing that INTRAC does at the moment is building that local consultant network and having clear registries and things like that, how to get access to these local consultants. Quite often, they're not always well known by the different stakeholders in the sector. And by accessing a kind of a local consultant network will definitely be to everyone's advantage. But then it's also about facilitating the knowledge sharing and the community building of those local consultants is, invest some time and money on a creation of maybe a community of practice. And I think that's one of the things that INTRAC is doing at the moment as well, really to get everyone's input and understanding of how does it work within their own country, their own environment and context. Because I think we're very quick to generalize how certain things work in the civil societies, but it is quite different from country to country or environments that we work in as well. So I think what will be great is a kind of peer learning program to really learn from each other how to make use better of the resources out there. I think what will also be quite good is a kind of a certification or accreditation of these local consultants so that there can be some kind of shifting. Who do we use as consultants, that it can maybe be built into our procurement policies, that there's more flexibility and transparency on the selection criteria. And going with that is always that kind of fair pay and that ethical kind of contracting. How do we go about with a local consultant versus an international consultant? Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about locally led development, shifting the power and so forth. But I really feel it's time that we put this into action and we really start to do something about it and really start to support the local consultants, because there's a lot of advantages and benefits that we will talk about a little bit later. But I do think all levels of the sector can benefit from it to strengthen the local consultant network's capacity to support the civil societies.
Great, thank you, Sareta. And yeah, a lot of what you said resonates with things we've been talking about in INTRAC, like could we have an ethical commissioning of local consultants and what would that look like, and how do we do anti-racist procurement policy? Bijay, do you want to talk to us a bit more about how a reduction in ODA creates an opportunity for these local consultants?
Thanks, Kate. And building on what Sareta said, we have been talking of international consultants. Let me start with that. So international consultants means, perhaps I'm slightly taking one extreme end of view, means more money paid per day, anywhere between 700 to 1,500 pounds per day, and also the product or the delivery is based on a quality, legitimacy, authenticity, and accountability. These were the words which were used. But we know, I have seen that in many of the countries that I worked during the last 30 years of my career, I saw that those qualities, legitimacy, from whose perspective that we actually talked of. So there was the knowledge generated was centralized. Knowledge generated was actually perpetuating the colonial attitude and the colonial divisions of centralization of power. Now, if I juxtapose to the local consultants, as Sareta clearly said, local consultants are primarily the important resources for the local civil society organizations, because they know the context, they know the culture intimately, they speak the language, they are always around the civil society organizations to provide them the follow-up, the support. So like say, it is a critical group of people who can be part and parcel of the system to support the local organization. What in INTRAC we call them as the consultant with soul. Yeah? What we mean by that, that actually we are talking of the consultants who are primarily talking of the change in the organization they're consulting for than only the contract. So they are primarily looking at how the organization is changed, the civil society that they're consulting for is primarily changed in terms of the capacity, in terms of accessing the resources, in terms of expressing themselves, in terms of connecting themselves, how they can actually change rather than only delivering a contract. And perhaps these are the consultants who ensure that there is a genuine ownership by this civil society organization who are hiring them. So genuine ownership of the change that is being proposed or that is being pursued. So it is almost like get to the heart of the matters and beyond just looking at only the symptoms. So you not only work with identifying the symptoms, but also work with them, the organizations that we are talking of, to address the underlying causes of the problems. And also is like says is also trying to facilitate a process where these local organizations, the community-based institutions or the local civil society organizations, they come out with their best capacity, their best skill sets, and their best ability. So that can only happen if the consultant is local, located there, and part and parcel of that context and the culture. Now, how INTRAC is doing that? That can best be done if we actually create a cadre, as Sareta talked about, that you create a cadre of the consultants at the local level and strengthen their capacities. And strengthen the capacity by connecting local solidarity groups, local network that you create, and connect them globally as well. So that what we are actually using this terminology, that the consultants for change. So let's say that we strengthen the capacity by connecting. So shared learning happens. So let's say then we actually see how we share resource is brought in, how can we actually go for resources where we can actually make use of each other's capacity and skill sets, and by being connected with each other. So that is a model that perhaps is the way forward. And this crisis that has happened with this reduction in foreign aid is a huge opportunity to shift that power from the centralized process of knowledge generations and accountability generation, quality generation, all these things that we talked of, to a more relevant, sustainable, locally led processes, which is primarily supported by the local consultants. So that is what I would actually like to say. Thanks a lot, Kat.
Thanks, Bijay. Yeah, that's great, and yeah, very much aligned with what we're trying to work towards as INTRAC. Natasha, would you like to say a bit about what could be done to enhance the market access for local consultants and how we can better recognise their strengths?
Yeah, I think, look, despite the sort of challenging environment, I think this is, and I've said this earlier, it's creating opportunities, right? So there is a need now to do more with less. And I think the opportunity that emerges from there is potentially finding a way to cut out the middleman. And the middleman might look different for different organizations and in different models. But what it does is it bodes well for the local consultant who, as Bijay mentioned, has the local knowledge, the expertise, the cultural nuance, speaks the language, has the relationships with the community, etc. And so I think being able, and this ties back to my previous point, being able to really articulate the value of the local consultant and the value that the local consultant brings is more important now than ever. I do think too, building on Sareta's point, this idea around establishing strong local networks, peer groups, and sort of mentorship groups between consultants is going to be really important in helping them sort of build confidence, understand sort of ways to bring them or to play a more leadership role, and to actually give each other recommendations and help each other access new markets and new sources of revenue, right? So I think that's sort of an important point as well. And then finally, this is going to be a very lofty recommendation, but I'm going to throw it out there. But I think there is an opportunity to think through sort of how we can leverage tech better to help consultants tap into existing opportunities. And again, depending on markets, some of this might exist, but really thinking about scalable ways and scalable platforms that can be put into place to really to connect in local consultants, local CSOs to opportunities as we cut out the middleman who usually has those sort of downstream relationships that they bring to bear.
That's great, thank you. And I look forward to hearing more about those potential digital platforms that we could use or other ideas. Does anyone from the panel want to add anything to that sort of theme of consultancy? If not, I'm going to move on to our next theme, which is really around knowledge. And Ashley, I wonder if you could share a bit your views around how we can support an exchange of knowledge and learning to help strengthen international cooperation and solidarity.
Thanks, Kate. I prepared a couple of notes on this one because, you know, we did some homework before we came here. So we're not just talking off the top of our heads, right? We've given these questions some thought. So my 3 points. I think number one, solidarity is always strengthened when ideas are exchanged, right? But all of us know that we go to places where we're always exchanging ideas. I think the ideas have to be interrogated, and we have to actually start interrogating our own ideas and our own practice. So to talk about exchange, I think is fine, but I think it has to be a critical exchange where we actually go deeply into the areas that haven't worked, the things that haven't worked for us. And we do it in an environment of trust and collegiality with others. You know, my initial point when I spoke about honesty, if we interrogate the areas that we are not good at, it's amazing what insights you can glean from sharing that with others who might be going through similar challenges. So I think that is the first point I want to make. My second point is that exchange is key to germinating new ideas. It triggers the imagination when you're having a really robust conversation with colleagues and comrades, right? And if we are removed from the shackles of the development discourse that has stifled our thinking and our ability to be creative for 30, 40 years, and now that we're facing a crisis, we don't know how to be creative, how to let our imaginations loose. We become preoccupied with issues of scale, right? Can this be replicated? Can it save the sector? And we miss the learnings that we get from those daily resistances against dehumanization. We've got to stop that. We have to, in the sector, we have to keep investments in these small spaces of resistance, because I promise you that's where the answers to a lot of the problems, not just that the sector is facing now, but to some of the intractable social problems that we have. That's where we're going to find inspiration to come up with good solutions. Places where people actually speak to the lived, they live the struggle, and we learn from that lived experience. And my last point, fewer conferences, more exchanges. My God, the philanthropy sector has a lot of conferences. I could spend my entire life just visiting various venues to talk about the latest trends in how we, and I'm not going to mention any of the hashtags because I might get myself into trouble, but let's stop giving papers and let's actually start having conversations that are based on a rigorous critical interrogation of ourselves as power holders within the sector. And I think that's how we're actually going to come out of this crisis, far more than having clever people telling us about what wonderful ideas they have. Sorry, it's a deep frustration. You know, we convene activists from communities in what we call solidarity hubs. And every single time people leave, they say, it's the first time I've been in a space where there wasn't an expert telling me what I need to do. In fact, we don't have speakers on our programs. And we have 3 days of rigorous engagement where local activists actually share the wisdom that comes from the work that they do. That's what we need more of. If we can have an exchange and knowledge program, that's where we should go. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Ashley, and great to have both the honesty in admitting that you'd thought about the question beforehand, but also the challenge to us all to keep talking and engaging and learning together, and how that is the basis of solidarity and resistance and imagination. So I always find it inspirational hearing those ideas from you. Natasha, do you want to say a bit about how the global minority might learn from their counterparts in the global majority?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, just love, Ashley, your point around sort of creativity and flexing that creativity and being able to sort of break free of the shackles and the bounds, and using this as an opportunity to think out the box and color beyond the lines. I think that's sort of applicable across the board and in so many different contexts. In terms of thinking about learning from counterparts, look, I think there's a few things in my experience that could be used as opportunities by CSOs. One is really thinking about how you're enhancing your transparency and your accountability. To my point about doing more with less, the ability to demonstrate effective use of funds at this point, and really be clear about the impact and the measurable impact that you're bringing to the table, I think is going to help form more trusting relationships and form more longer-term trusting relationships that are critical and make CSOs attractive funding partners right now. The second piece is around strengthening, and we've talked about this in pockets over the course of the last hour, but really strengthening operational efficiency. We had a funny moment when we had a bunch of our grantees together at Ashley Woolscoff, but at a conference a few weeks ago. And we were talking about what different sort of organizations are doing to try and navigate the challenging environment. And we had one of our partners say that he was the founder or the head of that organization. He took every other light bulb out of the office. And it's not necessarily because they couldn't afford the electricity bill, but it was a very strong message that we were sending to everybody on the team that we have to be really conscious about where we're spending money. It was a sort of this visual and this mental reminder to everyone that you have to be sort of super fiscally responsible, right? And I think having the collective buy-in and a collective effort around that is quite critical. I think there's also probably, and that comes with obviously the sort of the very obvious things around minimizing non-essential expenditure and taking a sort of a good look at some of what's going out of the organization. And the other thing that I think might be worth considering, and again, it's come up in pockets over this conversation, is to this idea of partnerships and working together and coming together, thinking about shared services, so shared admin services, shared space, shared go-to-market opportunities or marketing opportunities where we are we're sort of collectively tackling a problem that rather than each organization and each CSO trying to tackle it individually, right? So I think there's some sort of benefit in coming together. Now, appreciate I've gone a little bit off tangent on the question itself. The global majority might not necessarily need to do this. I think there are elements that can be learned from what the counterparts in the global majority are doing, but actually there's an opportunity, to Ashley's points, for CSOs in the global minority to think about this problem and approach it in a very different, unique, and creative way.
Thank you, Natasha. And again, some good practical ideas there. And I guess I was also thinking when we were considering this question about how much experience CSOs in the global majority have of navigating complex civic space and shifting environments, and how maybe that's relatively newer experience in the US and the UK, and how much we can learn in terms of the outward navigation as well. Wanjiru, would you like to share with us a little on how to build global movements based on equality rather than competition? And yeah, some of your thinking around that.
Thank you, Kate. I know we throw the word solidarity around a lot, and sometimes it gets lost in translation in terms of what it actually means. And we've had a lot of it today, and I use it in my day-to-day very often, not only because I need to use it, but because I believe in it, right? And part of the quagmire we are in as a sector is because mostly not of our own doing, but because the way the system was set up that pitted us against each other, because you're forced to craft proposals or bid for funding, whether short-term or long-term funding, from a pool of, your peers or counterparts, and package it in a way that stands out from the funders or from the bucket, and that really created a system of no collaboration. And we find ourselves in a place where we are almost competing with international NGOs. We find ourselves in a competition with international NGOs, local NGOs, and at the end of the day, what you're able to secure in terms of funding is really based on who gives you the money. So the agenda you're trying to push gets diluted in this whole process. So how do we move then from this sort of mindset of competition to solidarity-based funding that will force us really to rethink about how we work, right? It will help us to rethink and transition to collaborative, solidarity-based funding, right? So this model has been working in some spaces. If you look at humanitarian response, where there's provision of critical services, there are models emerging that actually collaborate and resource communities directly, right? And I mentioned that earlier. So what happens when you're collaborating with other organizations is that you're reducing the risk, right? You're reducing the risk, you're pulling the resources together, and you're shifting decision-making power. And you're sort of flattening the system. So instead of having all these organizations doing the same thing, I know it's painful, but we have to think about it. So how do we collaborate? How do we strengthen our presence and our services? Especially when now there's not so much money to go around and we are still expected to, keep serving the communities, do what we do. So competition needs to end, and we need to move to a solidarity-based funding where we are working together more collaboratively, and all the, the pooled resources will then help us, at least meet those obligations that we have set out for ourselves. The issue of governance as well. How are we making decisions, with regards to funding? How are we as a collective, civil society voice pushing back against some of these policies from our own governmental institutions, from our own nationalistic sentiments, that are now looking inwards? Civil society remains a strong pillar in determining how, some funding flows go, right? Or how they're modeled. So I feel like, pushing back on some of these policies that really continue to hurt the sector or really drain the sector of critical resources is an actual mandate of the civil society groups. So creating these equitable systems, seeing how we can blend some of the resources that we have with private sector, as well, being cautious, obviously, about the intentions and rationale as to why this is happening. And obviously, pushing forward locally led development again, and speaking to the funders, because some of us have, good access to funders and philanthropies who are now sitting there wondering, okay, so how are we going to continue funding this critical work? And they're also on edge because they don't know what's going to happen with the regulations and all of that. So I feel like the collective power of civil society organizations will really help us, move forward and provide a new thinking, a new framing around this. Also around decision making, I feel like what we are pushing also at global public investment is not really for civil societies, but it's pushing governments to also rethink how they fund their own national agendas, right? And the framing is, there are challenges that countries cannot face on their own. So how do you come together as a collective, pool resources, right? And, the whole paradigm of global north, global south is collapsing or has collapsed in terms of, the donor recipient model. So how do you come up with a new framing that will allow for equitable decision making, for, for us to demand, that our voice and agency is part of the agenda? So I think part of this is also based on trust, the conversation that we've been having, but it's a necessary conversation that we also have to demand from the majority world for them not to, completely look inwards, but to also recognize that there are challenges that, we have to, to share together and see how that can be done. So, those are my few contributions, and thank you. Back to you, Kate.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to mention anything on the sort of theme of knowledge? And if not, I'm going to move on to the last theme that we'd sort of identified to talk about today, which is around international NGOs. And Bijay, I wondered if you can say a bit about whether we can expect to see an increase in international NGO closures or mergers, and if so, what are the likely implications for ecosystems of civil society support?
Thanks, Kate. Let me just put it in the context that we live in today. I was just actually going through a report of Civicus, and I was stunned to see that 70% of our population in the world live in a space where there is no civic space available for expression, or little civic space is available. And it says only 2% of the population are there who can enjoy the civic space that we are actually talking of. Now, there are many reasons. There are national security reasons which has been used, the terrorism, then some of the questions on moralities. So those type of reasons have been used to shrink the space for the civil society. Now, in that context, we're actually talking of this world that we're living in, and how INGOs versus the local NGOs, or the local civil society versus international civil society, how they interact. In my understanding, building on what Wanjiru was saying, that there is a ecosystem that we need to actually strengthen with the solidarity of the local groups. I saw that in Kenya, where the local groups, they could actually come together as solidarity groups. These local groups were the women's groups, the youth groups. They could actually come together as solidarity groups to pursue their agenda, their agenda that they wanted to assert their rights for. Now, these solidarity groups that I'm actually talking of, I'm definitely talking of the local living realities. And these solidarity groups can definitely be defined as a civil society group or a local civil society group, or can be supported by the national civil society groups that are facilitating the process for these groups to come together as a solidarity group. Now, where we are talking of shared resources, that is being, as has been said earlier, the way they can actually come together to facilitate their linkages at various levels locally. Horizontally, they become a solidarity group. But it is also critical that they are linked to beyond national boundaries, so that their voice can be amplified, their voice can be heard, and they can still have access to resources. But at the end of the day, majority world doesn't have the required resources. That has to actually move still. I'm talking of the financial resource that has to move from the northern part of the world, or the so-called minority world, to the majority world for an equitable share and equitable access. So that has to happen. But having said this, if we are talking of the local groups being organized or coming together as solidarity groups organically, and assert themselves and actually expand the civic space that they are currently experiencing a shrinking part of it, they will still need to be benefited by connecting with each other beyond national boundaries. That connection, bringing them, or connecting them, connecting their experience, connecting their skill sets, connecting them to learn from each other, that role these INGOs can still play, or INGOs can still do that role to connect, to amplify the voices, and ensure that they join the INGOs, they join the local solidarity groups and the networked solidarity group or networked civil societies at the national level, they join them as solidarity groups to engage in the transfer of power and in the transfer of the resources. So that can be a critical political role that INGOs can still play, and they still exist as an essential part of this ecosystem, in my understanding, which they need to simply transform themselves to play that critical role of facilitation, connection, amplifying, and connect, and also shifting the resources. That is what I would actually talk of, where these collectives of local level, the solidarity groups, can be the citizens collective, there can be the collective that can promote the citizens' interest at the local level through horizontal solidarity, and at the global level through vertical solidarity, which is facilitated by the international NGOs. Back to you, Kate. That's all I had to say on this.
Thanks, Bijay. So quite a positive future of how the international NGO could contribute if they were more responsive to the local leadership and local action. Sareta, would you like to come in and say anything else about mergers and closures of international NGOs?
I think it's definitely something that's on the table at the moment. We see that there's actually a lot of organizations looking into this option of merger or even closure. Definitely, making their programs smaller and extra, getting out of certain countries and so on. And I do think in the next couple of years, we're going to start to see more mergers because it is all about kind of that survival side of things and affordability. But, I personally, I've worked with an organization where a merger has took place, and my kind of advice will always be just to do your homework, do your research, look at all the kind of options out there for you, because it might not necessarily be a merger. And you've started this organization for a reason, and don't lose track of that, because quite often that is what happens with mergers. The stronger organization is the one that will take the lead. And along the line, there will be kind of mission drift or going into a different direction than what you have been involved in as an organization. But that does not mean I do not recommend to look at collaborations and partnerships. And I think Natasha and Wanjiru has also talked about that we should stop seeing each other always as competition and rather see how we can work together in partnerships, that we have different expertise and different experts within our organization, and how we can complement each other, and then establish that kind of partnerships of consequences, that there's risk sharing. Because I think everyone wants to try to avoid closing down an organization. And there's definitely a lot of different options to explore and see, what is the best way for us going forward. It's definitely, if that does happen, it's going to create more opportunity for the civil societies within the different countries. And I think that's also key towards locally led development, that, we want to have these local experts coming forward, running and leading on the different kind of initiatives. So, it's going to be interesting times watching the space on how it's going to change.
Thank you. Yes, interesting times, but also really practical advice there. Don't rush into thinking about merger, think about your purpose. Ashley, there's been a lot of discussion around reimagining international NGOs. Do you think these cuts to aid spending will interrupt the process or accelerate it?
Look, it's definitely going to have an impact. I'm not sure why the reorientation of such an important element of civil society ecosystems have been so up and down, patchy in terms of their performance at reimagining their roles. Some have actually been quite good. Others have really made it painful. My goodness, it's almost as if we woke up to the fact that decolonization is something that has to happen, like recently, when it's actually been, for many of us in the global South, has been a reality that we've had to deal with for a very long time. So, as I said, some have done it better than others. But my sense is that the current crisis has kind of pushed people to speed up whatever it was they were doing. And I'm no expert on INGOs, and I don't study them. I work with a number of them, and a few of them are funders of ours. And I think what I've seen in my experience, my rather limited experience from the southern tip of the great continent of Africa, is, the responses vary between two extremes. I think the first extreme is, which I like, is that you intensify that journey that many of them had started, of intensifying, of deepening their practice of localization, of actually fundamentally changing how they engage and how they do the work that they've been set up for. And I think for me, that has been quite an interesting thing to watch. And I won't mention names, but some of the processes have been really quite transformative and quite radical. The other extreme is you double down on compliance and control. And unfortunately, I've experienced that too. And I think these two responses, the doubling down is very much about moving closer to where the resources are. So how do we make ourselves sexier to our foreign, our government funders, our back donors? And how do we make sure that we're closer there in order to ensure our continued benefit from the resources that are there? The other approach, the first one I mentioned of deepening transformation, is that it's opened up incredible conversations. I'm having incredible conversations with so many more of these global partners, these INGOs that I work with, where, I speak a lot about imagination. Because honestly, if we can't imagine, then I think we're sitting ducks, we're dead in the water. We have to imagine, and we have to be courageous in order to imagine. And I think that's going to be the litmus test of whether an INGO remains a relevant feature, or it's just yet another system of extraction of resources that should be reaching the global South. I think a lot of organizations, INGOs, continue to absorb resources that ensure their survival as institutions, but do nothing to challenge power, particularly in the global South. So I don't know if it'll interrupt the process of change. I hope it does, because we have to change something.
Thanks, Ashley. I always find it difficult to speak after you because you have such a great way of talking. But I just want to let you carry on speaking. There was a question in the chat, Bijay, that just we missed that I wanted to just put back to you, which sort of builds, I think, on what Ashley was just saying anyway, which is, should international NGOs be encouraged to stop the pseudo-localization by developing and transferring funds through national country offices organised as formal local actors? Do you have a view on that question? Do you feel able to respond?
Yes, Kate, and thanks, Ashley, as well. And I could see some of the other comments. I completely agree. I completely agree with this. It cannot remain as a rhetoric. It cannot remain as a statement of intention. And it cannot continue to extract the resources from the majority world to the minority world. It cannot. We cannot do that. So now I agree with Ashley that perhaps there is a need to see and engage to change that mindset. And it is what we have been talking of. I've been in this work for all these years, for 30 years, and we actually argued for the shifting power. Now, shifting power is not a statement of intention. Shifting power has to be acted on. There has to be a mechanism to do it. Now, this is high time that INGOs, accept that is the only way that all of us can work together and stay relevant and widen and expand the shrinking civic space. It's a time not to extract and claim that we are better than you. Rather, it's a time to come together and engage as partners, equal partners, where the international so-called beyond national category organizations, they can still contribute, in my understanding, to create opportunity to connect, not necessarily to survive, to connect, to amplify, not necessarily their views, but the views that is coming from the solidarity groups of the civil societies at the local level. Now, that is a shift in the mindset. I understand that we have been talking of that for last all these years, at least since the Istanbul Humanitarian Summit, that we talked of shifting power, we talked of, there are many things that we have been using these words. So it's a high time that we as INGOs need to accept that this is a high time that we engage in equitable and equal partnership, rather than continuing with our rhetoric and continue to strive to survive. If we continue to do that, then we'll be eliminated from the system. And unfortunately, that will be a very unfortunate case, because there is a role for somebody beyond the national boundaries to create that opportunity to connect, not for their own interest, but for the interest of the communities and their own perspectives, their rights, their experience, and so that they can actually get an opportunity and platform to express themselves. We live in a connected world. We live in a connected set of institutions. There is a need for creating that opportunity where those voices can be raised and heard. I strongly believe in this, and I agree with all the statement that has been said here, that let us go beyond the rhetoric and let's practice what we are trying to preach and actually do it to remain relevant as an integral part of the civil society groups, where we can actually work together rather than going by and working for our own survival. So that is what we must not do, and we should stop doing it.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that. Shifting power is not a statement of intention, it's a practice. I think if we practice that with imagination, then maybe things would move forwards. We're coming towards the end of the time, but I just wondered if everyone on the panel wanted to just share a couple of reflections, ending reflections, just either questions that I haven't asked you that you wish I had, or something that someone else said on the panel that you just want to pick up. And I thought, just to give you a little time to think about that, because I didn't tell you that I was going to come to you and ask it, I just was going to share what I've sort of taken away from what I've heard so far. So that last point that you were making, Bijay, about shifting power not being a statement of intention but a practice, I think is something we could hold on to every day and really think about that in these spaces of resistance and imagination that Ashley was talking about. Really find those spaces and hold on to that belief and that commitment to inquire, to be trusting, to be honest, and to listen and work with others. I think a lot of the themes that have come through are around resilience being about being stronger together, but also remembering your core purpose, and that sort of balance about being clear about what you're trying to do, but also working with others, asking questions with others, risk sharing with others, helping build resilience. And then what's come through everything you've said, all the panelists, is around local leadership and how to respond and build with local leadership, whether that's for a national level initiative or globally. And that speaks back to INTRAC's strategy of being locally rooted and globally connected. But I just wondered what else other people on the panel have taken away. And again, I'm just going to go through the order that you are on my screen, which you won't know about until I come to you. So sorry for that, but I'm going to start with Sareta because you're first.
Thank you, Kate. And yeah, it was great listening to everyone and the input from everyone. And, you know, as I was listening to everyone, I think, for me, a key thing is definitely that kind of collaboration, working together to make the civil society stronger, learning from each other, stop reinventing the wheel, have more conversations, have more discussions, and identify, kind of opportunities for partnerships. And I think just from my side, I love this kind of proverb, failing to plan is planning to fail. And a lot about financial resilience, success, sustainability is linked back to planning. And look into the future, where do you see yourself going forward as well? And not only being reactive, but a little bit more proactive, so that the shocks is not always so hard on us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll go to Bijay next.
Thanks, Kate. I just actually hearing all the perspectives and also going through some of the comments. It has been extremely a learning experience for me to see what others have to say. I would just actually reiterate that perhaps we need to recognize that we are in a regime, global regime, where shrinking civic space is seen to be a norm. So we need to actually stay together, stay connected, and ensure that we expand, we engage, and expand the shrinking civic space. To me, that can only happen if we stay rooted, connected, and committed. And that we do by living what we are actually preaching. Shift the power, resources, stay connected, committed, and rooted. That's all I have to say. All the best, guys. Great having all of you, and also great being part of this panel. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Bijay, and yeah, great comments. And I think there's a request in the chat that we talk more about political environments where civil society is at risk of being destroyed. And I think you responded a little bit to that straight away. So yeah, it's a theme that hasn't come up so much, but is obviously so important in all our work. I'm going to go to Wanjiru next, and then Ashley, you'll be last.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I think for me, what keeps resonating is that, this time, or these times we're living in, really call for us to demonstrate a tremendous level of courage, because it's not going to be easy. And it requires us to be courageous enough to look at ourselves and say, how did we contribute to this faulty system? Right? Courageous enough to say we need to dismantle it and build something new, and something new that works for everybody, not a few people. Courageous enough to say we've built silos, we've continued to work in ways that really don't help the people we supposedly serve. The courage, to admit that, our systems could be better. We need to do things differently, and, to really internalize and introspect and see how can we expand our thinking? How can we get together, think more broadly around some of these issues, create the space for ourselves as a collective to think about these things, push back, the courage to push back against dominant systems, because I think that's what we are trying to do here. And pushing back against dominant systems is not easy. And that's where the solidarity piece comes in. That's where the interconnectedness comes in. That's where our own collective wellness comes in, right? Because at the end of the day, we are seeing the structure crumble. And at the end of the day, folks who've been hiding behind log frames and budgets and reports, are still there. I mean, stripped of all their titles and everything else. So what's left? It's the interconnectedness that we have beyond the money, right? Money is important, yes, but we always say that the money you get, especially what we call the cold money, could actually turn you into what we are trying not to be. So we have to be courageous enough to also say no to cold money and look for the warm money, that helps us do and promote the values that we stand for, and look for the solidarity and for the people who will help us get there. So thank you so much for convening this lovely group of people, and I'm happy to continue the conversation elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wanjiru, and thank you, yes, for reminding us both of the courage, but also our own well-being and our own commitment. I think that's a good juxtaposition between two extremes that could pull you in different ways, and it's important to have them together. Ashley, you're going to have the final word.
Thanks, Kate. It's wonderful. It's a bit of an honor. I think all the people who are still on the call must be so envious of me because I get to work with such incredible trustees. So a big up for that. I really enjoy the times we get to interact, colleagues. But I wanted to pick up my one point is just to pick up on, I think the person who posted was called Violeta Vaja from Hungary and Romania in the chat group around political ecosystems. And it got me thinking that part of the problem is that we spend a lot of time trying to ensure our own survival for its own sake. And I'd be curious if somebody did a study that, oh dear, have I frozen? I hope not. Oh, okay,
No,
sorry.
we can see you.
I've been having very dodgy internet connectivity recently. I'd be curious if somebody has done a study about these moments of rupture in places like Kenya, gosh, where else? In Bangladesh, and certainly in Swaziland, which is a place that I lived in for 10 years, and it's just up the road from here, where there were these, and even in South Africa, where you had the riots, the looting that happened a couple of years ago. And in moments that fundamentally shift the political ecosystem, I'd be keen to know how many civil society organizations were present when those moments happened. And I suspect you'll find that there weren't a lot of organized formations of civil society who were in those struggles and in those moments of rupture. I know in Swaziland, civil society came later, especially the INGOs, and muddied the waters by bringing a whole lot of money into the situation. And what you've got now is a reassertion of power by the king. So that moment that could have led to fundamental change in a society was lost. And I think we must take some responsibility for that because we failed to find a strategic way to support the struggles of people that didn't actually upset it and diminish it. So part of this conversation about ecosystem has to be, why do we want to have an ecosystem of civil society? It's in order to ensure that there's a challenge to the ecosystem of power that currently dominates world politics. And if we're not asking those questions, I think we really are just talking to each other to find ways to sustain our livelihoods. I think we've got to see, is what we're doing actually advancing the challenge to power that has become so toxic in Europe, in parts of the developing world, certainly in the USA. And I think if we can reflect on that a little bit more, I think we might have interesting further conversations, maybe over a beer or a glass of whiskey or something like that. But thank you for the opportunity to be part of this, Kate. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Ashley. And I knew you would wrap it up better than I could. So thank you very much for those last words, and look forward to that virtual beer if we can't have one face to face. Thank you everyone else for joining. As I think Andy has just put in the chat, we feel very privileged and lucky in INTRAC that we've got such great panelists, and I hope you enjoyed, great trustees, and I hope you enjoyed hearing from them all. We did record the session, so we'll be sharing that and a summary of the session, and we will do future events like this. So please do sign up to our newsletter and come to the next one. And thank you to Ashley, Wanjiru, Bijay, Sareta, and Natasha had to leave, but thank you, Natasha, also. And hope you all have a good rest of day.